Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
Today we're going to take a look at a recent decision from the state of Louisiana regarding the Ten Commandments. And we're going to ask ourselves, what in the world we should be thinking about this?
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
I'm guessing you've already heard about the commotion in Louisiana because by the time this show actually goes to air, it's already going to be old news. And for all I know, it might already be at the Supreme Court, at least if the ACLU has anything to say about it. But just in case you've been living under a rock, let me get you up to speed. Back in June of 2024, Louisiana passed this new law stating that all public schools, from kindergarten through state-funded college, well, every single classroom is now apparently required to display a copy of the Ten Commandments. That display has got to be 11 by 14 at minimum, and it also has to be printed in an easy-to-read font so every kid in the room can see it. And of course, a lot of people found this new regulation to be a little triggering because it appears to cross that all-important dividing line between church and state. As you're likely aware, when the United States was originally created, the founders established, to use the words of Jefferson, a wall of separation between church and state. The church is not supposed to run the government, and the government is not supposed to run the church. It was originally a reaction to the way that Christianity had developed back in the Old World, where church and state blended and started to work hand in hand. Not that there weren't some exceptions to that practice, because there were some shining examples of places where religious tolerance was official policy, like the Dutch Republic of the 1600s or the city of Cordoba in Spain under Muslim rule back in the 1000s. Now, that one probably surprises a lot of you, but the Islamic State of Spain back in the day, we're talking 1,000 years ago, was actually more tolerant of other faiths than the Inquisition proved to be just a few centuries later. Now, all exceptions aside, the history of European Christianity is still largely a story of church and state getting combined. Now, there were times when various kings and queens disputed the authority of the church over them, but overall, there were a lot of blurred lines. So, as you know, when Europeans eventually got here to the New World, a lot of them came for the sake of religious liberty. They wanted the right to worship as they saw fit, the way they read the Bible. And of course, people being what they are, they did it rather imperfectly because some of the colonies up and down the East Coast actually practiced a lot of intolerance toward people who didn't share their particular theology, like the widely revered Puritans, who actually strung up the Quaker Mary Dyer for the crime of presenting herself in a Puritan colony with the wrong opinion. But of course, over time, the American religious liberty experiment actually proved a huge success. I mean, just look at the fruits of what the founders built. Many of you don't share my religious perspectives, but here we are, coexisting and getting along. I'm free to say what I please, and of course, you're free to turn it off. So, now let's think about that Louisiana law that says that the Ten Commandments have to be posted in every classroom. Of course, it's probably important to note that the law doesn't mandate keeping the Ten Commandments, which would be an obvious attempt to regulate religious morality through the power of the state. And that would be a big no-no. You must never go there. But is merely posting a copy of those laws a violation of the separation of church and state? Well, I'm certainly not the Supreme Court and I'm no legal expert, but let me unpack this a little bit anyway, from a preacher's perspective. If you're a Christian who cheered for that decision, maybe ask yourself one really important question. Would you find it acceptable if, instead of the Ten Commandments, the law actually required the teacher to put up a copy of the 5 Pillars of Islam, or maybe a series of posters with the Eightfold Path of the Buddha? If you're a Christian parent, I'm guessing your answer's no. And of course, the objection some people raised when protesters wanted this new law overturned had to do with the celebration of alternate expressions of sexuality that are explained in the classroom. And I've got to say, I can sympathize with that. I wouldn't want my child exposed to that subject at a young age either, because I happen to believe that sensitive subjects like sexuality really are the domain of parents. And of course, human sexuality is a massive part of almost every religious belief system. So, from a religious point of view, introducing those ideas into the classroom kind of seems like a violation of that church-state separation because, well, it can be so problematic for families who hold to a traditional religious point of view. And that point of view almost always includes things like sex. I myself would not want a public school teacher raising questions or promoting a religious point of view that openly contradicts my family's beliefs. Now, it's going to happen because no two people can agree on everything, but from where I sit, a lot of the activism I'm seeing has a distinctly religious tone to it. In fact, a lot of it really does look like an open attack on Judeo-Christian principles. But still, I really do get it. People who happen to hold a secular point of view wouldn't agree with me on the topic of sex in the classroom, and they wouldn't see it as a religious issue at all, because to them, it just looks like an attempt to create an inclusive atmosphere. I think there might be a limit to that objective because, again, we're dealing with a lot of really young kids, and I'm not convinced that the public schools have the right to turn them against the deeply held religious beliefs of their parents. But again, I'm certainly not a legal expert, and if they haven't already done it, I'll let the courts work out the details on this one, as I'm pretty sure they will. So, back to the Ten Commandments. I suppose you could argue that they are such a fundamental part of who we are in the West that everybody should be familiar with them, and I tend to agree with that. As a lot of really good historians have noticed, it's hard to explain who we are as a civilization without acknowledging the massive role that the Bible played in creating this place. So, should kids learn about that? I think they probably should. But maybe, at least in the public schools, it should have been a suggestion or part of the history curriculum and not a mandatory insertion into the classroom. I mean, let's just think about this. It's just a poster on the wall without any historical context or comment, and these are little kids. What impression does posting them on the wall create? Now, as a Christian, you're probably excited by that idea because you value those commandments like I do. They make good sense to you, and you know the power they have to help you create an authentic human life. But if I was a member of a non-Abrahamic faith, I'm not sure I'd be happy because the public school system was supposed to be for everybody. Which leads me to another kind of related issue. It's really not a very good look when some activists try to claim that private schools should never be allowed or that homeschooling should be forbidden because, well, then it really does start to look like there isn't room for everybody. And it does look like public schools are supposed to indoctrinate your kids. But let's put the politics aside for a moment and think about the Ten Commandments themselves because, well, I happen to be a fan. In fact, I think if you read them and really consider what they're saying, you will not find a better moral code. Now, you might not believe that they're divinely inspired, written by the finger of God, but I really doubt you'll find a whole lot to argue with in terms of using those commandments as a moral code. They're good. I mean, who's really going to argue that refraining from murder or stealing or cheating on your spouse, those are bad ideas? What would this world be like if everybody just actually lived that way? And I get it. The first table of commandments has a distinctly religious tone. It's a set of laws governing how people relate to God. And if you don't believe in God, you might not see the sense in that. But even then, I'd encourage you to look because those first commandments still make sense. For example, when it tells you to have no other gods before me, even if you don't believe in the God of the Bible, there's still some common sense there. I mean, all of us appear to be wired for religious behavior for whatever reason. You might not actually call it worship, but you will worship something. I promise you, you will. And if you make a god out of things like money or power or political ideology, you can still do a lot of harm because you're worshiping something that is not a god. Now, you might not believe in the God, but now you're behaving like you believe in another god, and it's still behavior that leads to negative outcomes. And speaking of negative outcomes, I need to shut up because it's time for a break, and I don't want you to miss what the good people who produce this program want to share with you. I'll be right back.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
Hey, Shawn Boonstra here. Did you know you can watch Authentic every week? Yep. Just search for Authentic with Shawn Boonstra on YouTube. It's that easy. Catch new episodes every week during our regular seasons and watch for free. And while you're at it, would you tell one or two people about the show? Thanks for your support.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Today we're talking about the 10 Commandments, and we started with that recent Louisiana law that mandated posting the commandments in every public school classroom. Now, though, I want to move past that and look at the 10 Commandments themselves. According to the Bible, when Moses met with God on the top of Mount Sinai, he was given a hard copy of God's moral law that God had engraved on tables of stone. It's not a long document. You can read the whole thing in a minute or two, and there's actually a pretty good chance they would have all fit on one table. But they don't. They're on two, which tells me there's got to be a reason for that. Students of the Bible have noticed that one of the tables deals with our duty to God, and the other one deals with our duty to each other. You might remember that's the way Jesus summarized it when someone asked him which of the 10 Commandments would be the most important. Here's what he said in Matthew 22. But when the Pharisees heard that he, speaking of Jesus, had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So, there you have it, Jesus' summary of what you find on the two tables of God's moral law. One of those tables deals with loving God, and the other one deals with loving your neighbor. And of course, the key word there is love. This is not just an arbitrary set of rules. It's not a matter of God trying to ruin your fun. He's telling you the best way, the most loving way to live. And of course, most of us get it wrong a lot of the time. But still, if you look at it, it's pretty much the perfect guide to living a successful life. If everybody just lived by the commandments, I think the world might quickly become a much better place. Now, historically speaking, people have struggled to figure out which of the commandments belongs on which table because, well, the Bible doesn't actually specify. I grew up believing that the first 4 commandments went on the first table because they deal explicitly with God. And the next 6 commandments belong on the second table because they deal with interpersonal relationships. You might say that the first table deals with vertical relationships and the second one with horizontal. But wouldn't you know it? Not everybody sees it that way. Over the centuries, a lot of really good scholars have put the 5th commandment on the first table, like this model that I've got here in studio. And that's the commandment that deals with honoring your parents. So why did they do that? Because your parents are just human beings, aren't they? But they're not just any human beings because, well, they created you. In your earliest years, your parents really kind of stood in God's place. They were the way that you were supposed to learn about what God is like. Now, I'm not convinced that I did an excellent job of that as a dad because I'm a rather flawed human being. But I was aware that Jean and I kind of served as intermediaries between our kids and God, at least to the point where they grew up and acquired the ability to exercise their own free will. From that point forward, our job shifted from regulating our kids to praying for them and continuing to point them toward the Creator. But in the very beginning, parents hold a place in a child's life that is somewhat analogous to the role that God plays in my life. That's why some medieval rabbis rightfully said that the 5th commandment could fit on the first table because, well, it's a vertical relationship. And when you do that, some people have noticed you suddenly get a very interesting pattern. It's almost like the commandments on the 2 separate tables kind of start to line up with each other. They show the same principles applied in different directions. On the first table, you get a principle for how to relate to God, and then on the second table, you get that same principle applied to interpersonal relationships. Now, I've got to admit, this is not an original idea with me because I learned it from a well-known teacher of the Torah, Dr. Foreman. But you know, the more I look at it, the more it begins to make sense. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to unpack this in a lot of detail today because I'm already more than halfway through this show, but maybe I can get you studying this for yourself. What is the very first commandment? Here's what it says in Exodus 20. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So what's that telling you to do? Well, it's telling you not to ignore God. Your relationship to the one who made you is too important to compromise by rejecting your Creator. So, assuming that the fifth commandment fits on the first table, what would the first commandment on the second table be? Well, it would be, you shall not murder. And what's that telling us to do? It's telling us to value other people. You don't get to terminate another member of the human race just because you don't like them or because they're standing in the way of your ambitions. So on one table, we have a command telling you you don't get to toss God aside when you think His presence is standing in your way. And then on the other table, you have a parallel commandment telling you the same thing about your horizontal relationships with other people. We're being told to value the existence of God and our fellow human beings. And wouldn't you know it? You find the same kind of parallel with the second commandment, which reads like this. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. What it's saying is that we're not supposed to insert any other God into our relationship, nothing between us and the one who made us. So what do you find in the same position on the second table? Again, assuming the fifth commandment goes on the first table, you shall not commit adultery. And of course, that's reminding us that you're not supposed to insert a third party into your marriage. Or if you're not married, you're not supposed to insert yourself into someone else's marriage. These are parallel concepts. Again, it's not original with me. I'm not all that clever. These are the observations of some pretty bright medieval sages. But they're telling us, whether it's describing our vertical relationship with God or our horizontal relationship with others, it's telling us don't betray relationships. And even though we're going to unpack each of these commandments just a little more in future episodes, let me throw a little bit of extra light on this one just to get you thinking. The second and seventh commandments are really a command against cheating. They emphasize the sacred nature of covenant relationships. And there's this really fascinating link between the sins of idolatry and adultery that I don't have time to show you before we take a break. So hang tight. I'll be right back.
Got kids? Get Discovery Mountain, a free weekly audio adventure to build their faith. Discovery Mountain. It's a place where the air is clear. So clear you can almost hear your imagination. A world of Bible-based wonder for kids everywhere to grow their faith and get closer to Jesus Christ. Discovery Mountain. Free weekly content that'll inspire and engage. Listen anywhere you get your favorite podcasts or at discoverymountain.com.
Retirement planning can be a stressful process, but it doesn't have to be. The friendly people at the Voice of Prophecy can walk you through the entire process and explain all of your options based on your specific needs. Whether you'd like to set up a trust for income or make a gift that will benefit your loved ones and change lives through the Voice of Prophecy, we're here to help. To learn more, call 1-800-348-5993.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
All right, just before the break, I was talking about the second and seventh commandments. The second forbids the practice of idolatry, which is adding other gods to your sacred relationship with the Creator. And the seventh commandment prohibits adding other people to the sacred relationship you have with your spouse. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but way back when, in ancient history, there were religious prostitutes that often worked in the pagan temples. And a few years back, I found myself wondering, what do these have to do with each other? I mean, these were temples dedicated to multiple gods, in direct violation of the second commandment. And when you line up the tables of the law, the commandment against idolatry appears to be related to the prohibition on adultery. So is there an intellectual connection? The answer is yes. I mean, just think about it. Adultery is an attempt to take a shortcut to a genuine human relationship. Today, the most prominent example we have of breaking the commandment is probably the explosion of porn here in the West. What you get with a prostitute or with pornography is an attempt to get some of the benefits of a relationship without the actual relationship. There's no accountability, there's no love, there's no respect. There's just a selfish attempt to bypass the hard work required of an authentic, loving relationship. And the same thing happens with idolatry. What people did way back when was create a bunch of gods in their own image, gods who exhibited all kinds of flawed behavior, ranging from violence to sexual immorality. I mean, just go and read the ancient mythology, read the stories of Zeus. And because all of us, or at least most of us, carry some sense of guilt over our own shortcomings and sins, we feel the need to address that guilt. So what did the ancients do? They paid off their imperfect gods. All they had to do was give a little money at the temple, offer a quick sacrifice, and then go on living however they pleased. It was another shortcut, an attempt to reap the benefits of a genuine relationship with God, but again, without responsibility, no accountability, without the love and hard work that goes into genuine, rewarding relationships. So both idolatry and adultery are actually shortcuts that rob you of an authentic human life. They're violations of sacred covenant relationships. And at the end of the day, it only makes sense to observe these laws because you're cheating yourself when you break them. Okay, maybe let's look at one more set of parallel commandments before we wrap things up. The third one, found in Exodus 20, says this: "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." So what exactly does that mean? Well, the way I learned it growing up was that it's a prohibition against cussing. And of course, the Bible does condemn what it calls foolish speech, and it tells us to hold the sacred name of God in the highest regard. But what's the essence of the commandment? Well, there's an important clue over in the book of Revelation, which shows us a group of people with a profound relationship with Christ. And this is how it describes them. "Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads." Now, Mount Zion, of course, is the sacred mountain of God. And the people who get to stand there with the Lamb or Christ, well, they have the Father's name written on their foreheads. And of course, it's symbolic language. It's not talking about a physical mark. It's talking about God's character. You may have noticed that when we say someone has good character, we'll say they have a good name. And that's because, historically speaking, your name was supposed to be your character. These people have the Father's name in their foreheads because they exhibit the character of God. And here's how the description continues. "It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as firstfruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless." So, the commandment against taking God's name in vain is dealing with a whole lot more than just your language. It's telling you, if you're going to call yourself a believer, if you're going to associate with God, then make sure it counts. Make sure your character lines up with God's character so that his name on you doesn't become a public lie about who he is. And what would be the corresponding parallel commandment on the second table? You shall not steal. In other words, do not take what doesn't belong to you. If you're going to take God's name, make sure you have the right to do that. Don't run around calling yourself a Christian if you're not going to live like Jesus. And yes, that's a really tall order for most people, and I know for sure I still fall a long way short of the glory of God. Just go and ask my family. I'm sure they can help you uncover a lot of my flaws because they're the primary victims of my imperfection. But still, when you're learning to ride a bike, there's a huge difference between falling off while you're trying to learn and throwing your bike in the lake and rejecting it, saying, "That's it, no more bike." But wearing your cycling gear around town to convince people you're an avid cyclist. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
All right, the clock on the wall assures me I've rattled on way too long, but let me recap what I'm saying because, well, we're going to spend a lot more time looking at the Ten Commandments really carefully. And we're going to ask ourselves if they don't make really good sense, if they're not an important key to finding an authentic human existence. We started today by exploring the decision in Louisiana, which appears to be an attempt to force God's moral law on everybody using the power of the state. That's a mistake because, well, God doesn't force people. I mean, take a moment to read through the Bible, all of it, and you'll see God believes in freedom of choice, ultimately even the choice to reject Him. The Ten Commandments are a personal code of ethics, something God intends for you to internalize because you're interested in a relationship with Him, and you're interested in living the best life possible. They're not supposed to be a bludgeon that you use on other people. Then we explored the possibility that maybe the fifth commandment, the one that tells us to honor your parents, well, it might not belong on the second table because it's not exactly describing a horizontal relationship like numbers 6 through 10. Your parents are not exactly on the same level as you because they created you, they gave you life. It's more of a vertical thing. And then, once we thought about the possibility that there are 5 commandments on each table, we started to line them up. We compared them and asked ourselves if the 5 laws on each table were each describing an important principle. On the first table, those principles are applied to our vertical relationship with God. And then on the second table, we find those same 5 principles applied to our horizontal relationships with each other. And then I ran out of time, and you can finish exploring the other 4 commandments. Ask yourself this: is there a relationship between resting on the Sabbath and not bearing false witness? I think there is, and I think that the ancient rabbis who studied this were onto something. But of course, what I want to do is encourage you to read this for yourself. So go ahead, give it a try, see what you find. And if you want some help getting started in your studies, maybe go to BibleStudies.com, where the good people at the Voice of Prophecy have provided an unbelievable lineup of free resources. That's right, free, to help you read the Bible like you've never read it before. I want you to find the satisfaction, the deep, lasting peace that comes from living in harmony with the one who made you. Because honestly, that's the secret to living an authentic life. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and you've been watching another episode of Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.